Puig. I'm Andrés, I'm the director of the Arts Catalyst. Welcome, welcome. I first came across Ivan's work when I went to Mexico City in 2009. I thought his work was beautiful then, and then I came across his partnership with Andrés and their fantastic SEFT model. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to bring it over to the UK initially to do a residency at the AND Festival in the Northwest, and now to actually have a lovely gallery show with Furtherfield. So I'll introduce people here, the artists, Ivan Puig, Andrés, Padilla, Domene. I'll introduce our main speaker, Malcom Miles, in a minute. Rob Lafrene is my colleague, curator at the Arts Catalyst, and he will be chairing the discussion later on. So one of the things about bringing the SEFT 1 to the UK was when we were going around trying to find a good gallery venue to put on this show, people kept asking us, well, what's the UK context? Well, why is this relevant to a UK audience? I guess my first instinct was, does it have to be? It's an amazing project about Mexico and about the Mexican context. But actually, you know, in the local is global things of significance. You know, you can't talk about modernity or about transport infrastructure in a broad sense. You always have to kind of make it specific. And their wonderful spaceship craft that travel the abandoned railroads of Mexico is a wonderful way to start to think about the ruins of modernity. So then we were thinking about having an event today. Professor Malcom Miles is Professor of Cultural Theory at the University of Plymouth. And we knew Malcom because he came and gave a talk at an event we organised at the Baltic in Newcastle a few years ago on these infrastructures. And his work, I think, has a lot of resonance with Los Ferranautas' work, and I think he can provide a context to the exhibition that cites it very much in the global. So what's going to happen is Malcom is going to speak first, and then there will be time for some questions and answers. And then Ivan and Andrés will introduce their project for anyone who hasn't been up to the gallery or who couldn't quite hear over the wind and the aeroplanes their talk earlier. And then Rob will chair a bit of a conversation, but we'd like this to be quite participatory, so do chime in with questions at any point. So I'll also about Malcom, he has a new book coming out called Aesthetics, which I think is being launched on Wednesday, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I should say at the outset I'm not an expert on the railway industry. I'm not an expert on heritage or archaeology of ruins. But I have been doing a lot of thinking around the idea of modernity and what was good and what was difficult or went wrong, and what are the prospects now to look back on it and maybe bring back some of the thinking that was really quite utopian in some ways within modernism. That's quite complicated, but I'll try and explain a little of it as I go along. Well, I suppose modernity came to an end somewhere between the failure of revolt in Paris in 1968 and the Thatcher-Reagan years. So somewhere around the 70s. It doesn't make sense to try and put an exact date. But I noticed this image. It's at Bristol Temple East Station. It's about halfway on my journey from the West Country up here. The abandoned 1970s concrete hulk of the GPO sorting office. Huge site, absolutely enormous, empty for years and years now. But a kind of image of the modernity that is over, that gets very easily written off. It's all to do with concrete hulks, motorways, planning blight, etc. It would be very easy just to write off the whole of that post-war development as having got us to either nowhere or somewhere rather pleasant. And in front of it is the high-speed train, which is the same train that got me to Planet in half an hour late today. the prototype of which was designed in 1970. They have been re-engined once, but they are still in service as the main fleet of Great Western, which actually you could argue should now call itself a heritage railway, because its main stock is heritage. Lots of heritage railways around the country with things not much older than that, though some are a bit older. More seriously, I think if we look back to 40s and 50s, the rebuilding after the war, after the bombing, many cities, Southampton, Town Hall and Art Gallery there. If you go to Newport, you'll see one that's almost identical, same architect. They tended to have to do them rather fast, so they recycled drawings sometimes. There was an extraordinary desire to make a better world. And I suppose I'm really a child of that vision. I was born in 1950, so figuratively I'm a child of the Attlee government. Born 3 years after the beginning of the National Health Service in an NHS hospital. I remember going on the trolley bus to Hounslow with my mother to get the free orange juice that was available for infants. There was rationing. I can't pretend I remember the ration books, but we would have had them, obviously. And there was the Festival of Britain in 1951, which I don't remember, and probably wasn't taken to at 1 year old. And I was taken to the coronation in 1953, but having unconsciously already decided to be a Republican, I don't remember the program. But I was held up in the street to see the carriages go by, no doubt. But between these two images, a whole world passed. There was that amazing vision that we will build a better world, we really will. That it will be for all social classes. It will be fair, it will be open, and all the infrastructure is owned by the state, by the people. So the railways, energy, water, there was a gas board, a milk marketing board. The state actually had a real place to protect the commonwealth, the public benefit. That was the core ethos of that post-war revival. When the Ronan Point tower block fell down, because the lady called Ivy, who was a cake decorator, got up very early, about 5:45 in the morning apparently, and went to make a cup of tea, switched on the gas stove, and the whole side of the building blew up. She survived with minor injuries, so 2 or 3 other people didn't. And there are also people who woke up, because it's early in the morning, in some of these floors here, lying in their beds, looking at the sky instead of the wall opposite, and seeing rubble falling down in front of them. So that wasn't quite what they'd expected in their brave new tower block. It was one of 3 on the site. I met the architect Sam Webb, who did a report for the tenants on this. The local authority tried to get people to move back in. They patched it up and said it was really all right. But if you'd seen it like that, you might have doubts. And he found 2 things. One, it was very badly built, just in practical terms. So there was old newspaper, tin cans stuffed in where it should be solid concrete, etc. So abuses of that kind. But also that the system's design, which is a Danish system, made for much lower buildings than that really, required the precision, he called it the precision of a watchmaker in putting the pieces together, 18 floors up in a store, in a high width. So it wasn't entirely surprising that some of the joints weren't quite right and so on. So a minor pressure point just took off the side of the building because it sort of rippled up. And once it started, there was nothing to hold it. Now, the problem is, the social housing that was built after the war was very well intentioned. And some of the estates were actually very high specification. If you go to Thamesmead, on the southeast fringe of London, it was used in Clockwork Orange as a kind of desert, no man's land place. But actually, the design is not too bad. The material is quite good, the amount of space is good. Had you been able to go to the Haygate's flats in Southwark before the local authority decided they shouldn't be there anymore, but they should have yuppie townhouses instead, you would find the amount of space in each flat was far better than anything you could get now. So the intentions were basically good. It's very easy with the televised demolition of tower blocks. Actually, they decided not to televise one in Glasgow for the Commonwealth Games because they realised there were certain sensitivities. Like, I used to live there, don't blow it up in public. into most of the new building were actually enormously pleased. They had indoor toilets, hot water, wonderful views, etc. But the media hype around all this very quickly gave a negative image to modernity, as if the modern dream had failed, was planning blind, spaghetti junction, Roman point, and equivalents on the other side of the Atlantic and so on. Now it seems to be a colossal, sad thing if we leave it there. And we're in a kind of funny state at the moment. We're surrounded by the ruins of modernity, not just the physical ones, but the state itself. The state has been abandoned. The state has, in neoliberalism, the state has become a kind of agency for outsourced governmental services for capital. And really very little more than that. There are some residual functions that it still tries to do. At a local level, it's cut to pieces. Very little power, very little money, just lots of complaints. So the negativity gets kind of friendly to the outside of the system. At the same time, an extraordinary kind of consumer paradox is announced to us, in which blue is the new black. We will wear black until there is something darker. All of these extraordinary desires are conjured, as if it leads to happiness in some way. Obviously, I don't think it does, but I'm not much of a consumer. So what we get as a result of the shift from modernity and the state to post-modernity, neoliberalism, global capital seems like that, perfectly decent 19th century houses all boarded up because they've been bought for a redevelopment scheme, which didn't in the end happen. It's in Liverpool near the football club. And praxis, which was a key term in Marxism. Praxis, like, if you had to say the three top words in Marxism, it would be praxis, alienation, and immiseration. It's a Euro consultancy. I mean, that's it, it's over, you know? But, child of the Attlee government, I still cling on to it because it's too bleak a world to be without it completely. So, the New World Order, where we're all at sea and the marker boys have more or less gone, sink or swim. Most of us will probably sink, especially with climate change. That's another talk, so I won't go too far. But the western Antarctic ice sheet is going into the sea, which means the sea will get a lot bigger. So if you live on an island in the Pacific or something like that, it's a serious worry in the next 10, 20 years. And cities constantly redevelop, urbanize. Sometimes the relics, like that structure in the centre there, are retained as a kind of mascot, sort of heritage culture that, yeah, it's kind of nice we could keep it there, providing it's meaningless, completely decontextualized, not part of industry anymore. And also with climate change, of course, it's very easy to write off industry as well as modernity, because they look, industry is to blame. All that pollution, all that stuff they produce, all that plastic, it's all industrial. Couldn't we go back to living off the grid and trees and so on? And George Monbiot's book, Feral, is not an argument for that, it's an argument for rewilding certain already semi-wild places. And it's actually quite interesting to read. But one can understand how there could be a reaction against the whole project. So I suppose on one hand I'm saying, I hope it isn't completely over, that we can extricate something that was good in modernity and think about it again in new ways. And on the other hand, I'm saying, well, I also don't want to flee into that escapist realm of an idyllic green world, which actually isn't really there anymore because most farming is now industrial, etc. The countryside is a mixture of a leisure resort and a food factory, for the most part. Now, railways. So it's quite, when I got the email saying, would I come all this way to London, which I don't like anymore when I was born here, and talk about this, so that's quite interesting. So my son is a railway enthusiast. So most weekends we're off at Heritage Railway somewhere in the southwest of England. There are lots of them there. So he sees things like steam trains. And there's a whole society around heritage railway preservation. It's almost all volunteers. Enormously hard work, rebuilding the old closed branch lines and so on. And there are lots of them there, lots of websites. So that's great. But you also pick up things like how important the railways were in all sorts of things that actually became part of modernity, including national identity. The fact that there's Britain is because partly there's a national railway network that connects all the bits of it together. Bits that are now going their own ways. Time, standard time. I can't remember what date, but at a certain point in the early 19th century, the time in London was different from the time in Bristol. Now, if you're writing a railway timetable, that's quite problematic because you sort of need the same time everywhere to get things to connect up. Otherwise, you'll miss all your trains. And given there were lots of private lines developing all over the country at that time, it needed coordination. So even something as basic as the fact that the time on my watch is the same as the time on your watch, even though I come from a long way the other side of the country, that wasn't the case until we had the railways, which we had to bring in standard time. And lots of other things to do with technology. And I suppose now there's a kind of romance around steam, not quite so much around diesel. I really like these kind of engines. My son does a sort of teenage rebellion because he says he likes diesel better than steam, so that's fine. We just go with both, it's great. And there are lots of old tracks, there he is. That's near Abbotsbury in Dorset. In the 1960s, Beeching, who was a chemist, not a transport man, brought in by the government to write a report on the railways, which said basically closed most of them, all the little branch lines. They used to have a little engine, a couple of goods wagons, one passenger carriage, taken off the express from London at a certain point and attached to the local train. So you actually had an amazingly coordinated network of travel right across the country that worked. It wasn't always particularly fast, but sometimes it was faster than it is now. The first engine to go to 100 miles an hour was City of Chimney, Great Western Railway, in 1904. And they didn't tell anyone because they thought the passengers would be too frightened, thinking they were going at 100 miles an hour. But there was great competition between Great Western and Southern, who both did routes to the West Country. So that was between Taunton and Exeter, miles an hour, on a very straight track. They, I think, go at about 90 now on that track, so it actually was slightly better then, but more expensive to buy a ticket. There are lots of these old tracks left. They're often public footpaths. You can find them on Ordnance Survey maps. Sometimes they've been turned into cycle tracks. Sometimes they're partly across private land, partly open access, it varies. And they're in rather beautiful places, a lot of them. So we've walked along a few of those, and that's that sort of connection to this project in a sense that you realise that what on one hand is quite attractive rural trace of a past that isn't quite there anymore, though you find odd things along the way, like a little hut or something. It's kind of just a nice place to go. But actually, you know, it's more important than that, that a lot of the physical traces of that nationwide, localised as well as nationalised network are still there. And I just wonder if some of the ideas could be brought back along with the infrastructure. So this extraordinary technological advance of the railways, and it really was state-of-the-art stuff for a long period. And the Great Western Railway introduced standard parts for all their engines. So when they came into the works at Swindon, which used to employ 10,000 people there, now there's a museum there, but otherwise it's a designer outlet and yuppie flats and so on, and not all of it redeveloped yet. Whichever engine it was, Type 3, 4, 5, whatever, standard parts to stick them straight in when they need replacing. Incredibly efficient. So the railways were really at the forefront of technology in this country until, I think, probably around the 1950s, when there was some rather unhappy ventures with the new diesel engines, many of which didn't work well enough, but had already been ordered before they tried out a prototype, etc. And then we had Beeching, we had Ernest Marple's Transport Minister opened the M1, the first motorway, and it was all to do with roads and motor cars. And Mrs. Thatcher didn't like trains, so probably only went on one if she was forced to. So we've had kind of negative attitude and de-investment ever since, and we're still paying for that. Sorry, wrong way. I did notice, thinking of your Railway Museum. And it just seemed to me, wouldn't it be a great idea if you could have railway taxis on these old branch lines that could the track be relayed? It would be so much quicker than the road, so much cheaper to run. And with the loss of all our local bus services due to government funding cuts, and it really is extremely serious in some parts of the country, including this country, maybe there's an idea to revive it. However, I want to kind of move on now to a much wider way of looking at this, which isn't to do with railways, it's to do with modernity. And the question of ruins, because I sense myself being drawn into this notion of the ruins of modernity. So I quite like the idea, very much like the ideas of modernity itself in some ways. Building a better world, yes, believe in that, still a socialist. But I know I'm also attracted to ruins. I like these old places with traces of things. And I kind of wonder why that is. People have written quite a lot about this. But there's an allure of ruins that isn't there if it's in pristine condition. It's a very different kind of emotional response. And there are a number of ways to look at that. One of them is statues of the mighty that fall down show you that power leaks. Power doesn't survive as long as it's there. Shelley's poem Ozymandias is possibly based on these feet in Egypt, which are actually the feet of Ramses II at his temple of Thebes, which Shelley went to. But his poem of Ozymandias is actually about George III. It's not about ancient Egypt. It's about the notion of tyrannical power. In the end, ends up like that. Since then, people like Henri Lefebvre, French Marxists, have written about power leaks. It has inefficiencies, it has cracks. It doesn't deliver on the terms it sets out. And Michel Foucault, of course, has written about how power creates resistance of itself, almost automatically, where there's power will be resistance to it. So that gives a kind of hope. Maybe ruins partly tell us that. Paradoxically, maybe they also tell us about survival. A lot of images are ambivalent. They can be read in almost contradictory ways at the same time. I don't see any problem with that. The perception is in one's own mind, not in the object itself, obviously. So maybe in a dangerous, a difficult world, we also like the idea that however much things get changed, however much they decay, they are still there somehow. It doesn't completely go away. I suppose both of those things are attractive ideas. But then I also wonder, now, did socialism die with modernity? I'm using socialism in a quite broad context that would span Marxism to the anti-government, to social democracy, and so on. The art historian Tim Clark, in a book called Farewell to an Idea, writes right at the beginning of the book that when he was trying to think of how to introduce his studies of modern paintings, basically, and sculptures, the idea came to him almost as a tangent that socialism and modernity died at the same time. Then he writes, well, modernity is almost unreadable now, or modernism, modernist art, seems like a really strange stuff now. And of course it is very old. You think 1910s, 20s, 30s. It's a long time ago. Sort of around, some of it before my own father was born. So we're looking 2 or 3 generations back here. Clark doesn't quite explain the bit about modernism and socialism. What he says about modernity is it doesn't seem remote because it just went away. It's hard to read now because the conditions that it prophesied have actually happened. And we're looking now from after the event. And he means things like the idea of progress, including technological progress, but also intellectual progress. And I suppose there is one whole area, one whole element of modernity that is about expertise, the notion of progress, going forward. In art, that would be the idea of the avant-garde, leading society to a better world. And we've got to a new world. It just isn't the one we wanted. It's a different one that somehow has happened. And that leads us to go back into the thinking that began in the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, which is rationality, which underlies all of this. And Clarke says, well, rationality was, the sociologist Max Weber uses this term, which I think he borrowed from Schiller, the disenchantment of the world. And this is really easy to misunderstand and important to understand. Clarke says the disenchantment of the world is horrible. It makes us really insecure. And any cult or charismatic leader who comes along and says they can turn the clock back will have a wide following. And we had some of those in the middle of the 20th century, the 1930s in Italy and Germany, for example. Charismatic leaders. And that's very dangerous. Primo Levi, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, writes of reason as the last defense against fascism. And I think that's important to hold on to. But there's a basic problem in the middle of rationality. And we're not going to do a big philosophical discourse. That could be done. And there are lots of people like Adorno, Horkheimer in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment who've done that incredibly beautifully in some ways. You still put it very simply. Knowledge becomes power. But it does it in two ways. Knowledge can be power over nature, the world, other people, everything, or it can be power to emancipation, empower. One of the difficulties is I can't empower you. You can only do it yourself. I can use the words and tell you about it and so on, but I can't do it. That's only inside you. The problem with the avant-garde is if artists or writers say, we will lead you to the golden dawn, which unfortunately happens to be the name of a fascist movement in Greece now, that implies we know the future, but you don't, so we will lead you there. The power relation is unchanged. So it seems to me that at the heart of modernity, there are questions about rationality and knowledge, and the difference between power over, or domination of the world, which certainly science and technology can give us in great measure, and emancipation, the idea of society that is made by its members, according to their values, through consensus, and so on. And I suppose socialism comes right in the middle of all that, because it's deeply flawed. If we look at the socialist states of the East Bloc, the huge abuses of power over. At the same time, they had extremely good welfare provisions. The GDR had fantastic welfare provision for mothers and children and elderly people. With unification, it was very difficult for a lot of people. Its industry was highly polluting and very old in its equipment and so on. So yeah, there were huge problems. But if at the heart of socialism there's a value that's to do with equality, self-empowerment, things of that kind, then maybe we have to say that isn't over. That at the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was a lot of necessary regrouping and rethinking. Maybe we are approaching the point where we can start to make some sense out of that in the next few years. There's also, thinking of that notion of the disenchantment of the world, quite a major stream of culture, literature and art, that actually is trying to re-enchant it. Susie Gatlin, art critic in North America, wrote a book called Re-Enchantment of Art in 1991, that was hugely popular among art students, and still in print. And a lot of it is very interesting to read. I think most of the artists she profiles have sort of dropped out of art history now. That's a side point. The difficulty is the world can't be re-enchanted. And the reason for that is very simple. That the disenchantment was freedom from the rule of mysterious fate, from superstition, from the notion that we have no agency. Now, if you move to the other extreme and say we have total agency, that's also very problematic, because that's huge power over. But if we can think of those as polarities on an axis, and thought moves up and down along that, there's a potentially created tension between those 2 points, then maybe that's where the work of theory, for example, takes place. But there certainly have been lots of objections to progress, to modernity, to industrialisation and so on, including Richard Jefferies after London, 1880-something, let's be quick now, but where he writes of a world after some unspecified catastrophe where the whole of the country has gone to pot, basically. The brambles are growing everywhere, it's wild. And London is under a swamp 40 miles long that exhales very nasty miasma. So it's sort of dead. And the bodies of all the Londoners have dissolved into black mud, but their skeletal hands appear through the surface, clutching coins. So make what you like of that, you can read it for yourself. It could have been a comment on capitalism. Bear in mind also, Friedrich Engels was writing about working class housing in Manchester in the 1840s, much of which was alongside of the railway lines in what we would probably call shanty towns, little self-built huts. So it's easy to think of industry as the villain of the piece, having caused lots of pollution. The sea is full of rubbish. When they were looking for that Malaysian plane, as someone on the news said, it's very hard to find anything because the sea is full of rubbish. So we spot lots of stuff, but it's just junk. It's been there for years. And the beaches are full of rubbish too. Things like aerosols have a long life. And some of the reclamations haven't been quite what we might have hoped for either. After the civil disturbance in Toxteth, Michael Heseltine went and announced that Liverpool would get a garden festival, which would settle all its problems, create employment, make a wonderful sort of one-class society, and so on. The site then became derelict for years and is just now being redeveloped for yuppie housing. In Germany, there have been some quite interesting things. So where in the Ruhr, the old mining power station sites have been turned into a kind of industrial archaeological sites. Zollner, which you see there, was probably the biggest colliery in Germany. It also had a coking plant and the most modern power station, perhaps in the world, designed by a Bauhaus architect, owned by Adolf Hitler in 1933. Hitler had no problem with Bauhaus architecture for industry, just didn't want it in domestic buildings. Bauhaus did have a problem with Hitler. And they got convinced out. But this is now a series of museums, a restaurant, etc. And an extraordinary sight to wander around. It's absolutely massive. It's bigger than Finsbury Park. And there are these things all over the place. And you can just wander for a whole day. It's amazing. Not far away in Duisburg, there's Emscher Park and the North Landscape Park, which join together. Emscher Park follows the River Emscher a long way, you see on one side there. Here they've taken some of the huge towers, and one of them is used for people to learn abseiling, going up and down the outside of it. Another one is used to learn diving on the inside, so it's filled with water, and it's supervised. It's not like, go and jump in if you like. So there are courses, so there are quite a few leisure functions taking place in these. What they haven't done, and this was a massive project across Germany, what they haven't done is revive the local economy, which is what they claimed they were going to do. So they're interested in life in various ways. But just like new art galleries, they don't change the economy just by being inserted. And some artists have worked on these issues too. Hermann Prigard, German artist who had to leave Germany after 68 because certain political issues, he was sort of warned to go away quietly for a while. Came back to work on quite a few brownfield sites in the Ruhr and the ex-GDR, including Gelsenkirchen, which is actually where he comes from, where it's a huge landscape park. His approach, I had quite a few conversations with him. We spent a week going around his sites. Some days he's dead now. But, his approach was industry was not bad. He emphasized that continuously. Industry gave lots of benefits, like work and work solidarity, organization. material benefits that we take for granted, like the electricity. In fact, we have heated houses and so on. And he used the detritus of industry to make traces through pathways and on a big slag heap, basically in the distance through the trees there, concrete slabs that were just abandoned, stacked up to make a henge structure. There's another place where he does that, the Acropolis near the German-Polish border, which was a site of brown coal, open cast mining, where you came along the road and suddenly it just dropped about 300 feet, and there was an enormous hole in the surface of the earth. Local people were very suspicious of us walking along there because they thought we must be Westerners wanting to buy up cheap properties. And there was an understandable sort of, it was like a siege mentality. Again, he used concrete slabs that were left over from some abandoned structure to make a henge-like structure on the top of this yellow ramp. He always insisted on making sure that there was employment for local people building these things, so at least there was some, if temporary, social benefit there. The mound, which is about the size of Glastonbury Tor, is covered with broom. So his two things were reusing the detritus of industry, because it wasn't that. It should be remembered. So this is almost like a memorial, a celebratory memorial. And what he calls succession planting, that is the natural growth that grows there anyway, using that to cover, so that in the end it takes over. He made one work on the ex-German west-east border, in the middle of a forest area where they had a lot of acid rain, so lots of dead pine trees there. He made a kind of earthwork using pines to make a structure, filling it up. And then just planting lots of brambles and wild roses, things that were already there. And at some point, the whole thing will just disintegrate, it will rot, and it will... I thought this was really interesting, that the work is actually handing over to natural processes. At the same time, it will never completely go away. In an aerial photograph, you will see a different drainage pattern. There will be some trace that a person made something here. There was agency, but there was also whatever's the opposite of agency, dissolution. Now, that, to me, which he expressed as an artistic attitude, seems to me to chime very importantly with that notion that we have a creative tension. Industry wasn't bad, it did lots of good things, it also had lots of flaws. Somewhere between the two, you'd start to look at it again. Colford and Cross, two London-based artists, produced this project, which was rejected by the Commission for Cannock Chase in Staffordshire, to put a big concrete chimney, possibly emitting smoke, in the middle of the reservoir. Again, as a reminder that actually this isn't just a boating lake, this is where a large slice of British industry began, with mining and smelting and so on. And let's not write it off, let's not forget it. Because it wasn't only making things, it was, again, trade unionism and so on as well. And another not forgetting, of course, is Jeremy Deller's film The Battle of Orgreave, which keeps getting mentioned on the radio. I notice people sort of keep going back to that, how unfair the media coverage was and so on. And I suppose there's an endless capacity to reappropriate. Rachel Whiteread made a sort of memorial of the inside of a house that was being demolished in Bow. But I went 2 or 3 times 6, I lived in East London then briefly. I noticed most of the people around it were people like the art school lecturers with cameras taking pictures of it. There was also someone who chained himself to the railings to be photographed, but he didn't do it properly. They were just sort of looped around. He wasn't actually locked on. I thought that was cheating. Had his picture taken, and then it went away again. It should be there for at least a day. Stones thrown or whatever. But people put all sorts of notices. No, that's the anti-M11 and Rose protest campaign neatly up on the top there. And I thought, it's a wonderful idea. Home is where the heart is. If we lose our homes, we lose our hearts. And Bow didn't really need public artworks, it needed houses because there was a housing shortage. And I suppose for me, looking back, there's a kind of intellectual, emotional home somewhere in modernity that I don't really want to give up. So when Heather and Ivan Morrison produced their amazingly beautiful structure called I'm So Sorry, Goodbye, which is a double geodesic dome. If you have to be quite old to remember the Buckminster Fuller and geodesic domes, but they were meant to be the architecture of the future, and later were made from the normal annual clearing of trees in Tatton Park in Staffordshire. But you see right at the top there's a little bubble, like a sort of space age thing, as if the whole thing is going to lift off Earth when it's no longer habitable. They can abandon it and go and live somewhere on the moon or Mars or, I don't know, wherever the super rich are going to go when they've messed up the planet for everyone else. So, once upon a time in modernity, there were lots of things, and that's the end now, but I may have gone on slightly too long, but my argument is, very simply, modernity failed in lots of ways, but it was well-intentioned. And actually it was more than well-intentioned, it was utopian. And I don't want to let go of that. I want to extricate those good intentions and that belief that there can be a better world. I want to bring that back to think about it again in this hideous shit called neoliberalism that we're in now. Thank you.
Bring Ivan and Andrés together. Should we just have the discussion with the three now, or?
Well, I have a question.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Wouldn't we better?
Yeah, let's just start. A question from Ivan. So those of you who have been up, who've seen Ivan and Andrés to speak about the SEFT project. Yeah, Ivan.
I was wondering if whether it was authentically utopian or just as in the Green Revolution we saw, it was the utopia was just the arguments to ongoing the underlying real economical interest. But that was a question for modern society.
Good question. You mentioned the Green Revolution, which was an idea that there could be an agricultural revolution all across the world that would make lots more to eat and help lots of people in lots of non-European countries and so on. I think that was the beginning of one story. At the end of that story was probably something like GM crops, which is where a few companies take over a seed monopoly, and that's another Green Revolution, and it's really all about profit. And the Green Revolution, if you read people like Vandana Shiva writing in India, which is still a largely rural country, about 70% rural population, where she claims, and it's entirely credible, a country like India with a massive population can feed itself using local agriculture, traditional methods. Because these are endlessly varied, which means because it's very diverse, if there's a problem with one bit, there's all the others are left, etc. Whereas monocropping, if something goes wrong, you've lost a lot. It localizes the money too, keeps money in the local community, and that's very important instead of creaming it off to the super excess purses elsewhere in the world. So I think what we can see from things like the Green Revolution and other claims to make huge steps forward, progress in various ways, is the extent to which capital seeks to contain everything. It appropriates the lot. We even see this in culture. In 2009, Tate Modern had a show called Street Art, where the outside, not the inside of the building, that was off limits, but the outside was covered in invited street art, which we used to call graffiti, but it's now more marketable, huge panels stuck to the outside of the building. An international festival of street art, sponsored by a Japanese car manufacturer, with guided walks through East London, where you could see street art in its safari situation. And no doubt artists would jump out at you and go, "Ah!" or something like that. So the art world is actually a very good model of capital now, because it can appropriate even what, not that long ago, was called antisocial illegal activity, and give it a new name, and sell it, and create a whole group of collectors, many of them in areas like financial services and advertising and so on, prepared to put serious money, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands, into street art or urban art is another name for it, as international and so on. So the art world can appropriate almost any departure. Almost anything that seems to be against comes in. Capital does that all the time too. So it can take ideas that came from diverse sources, politically and intellectually, and reappropriate in its own image. I've been reading a book recently by Peter Sloterdijk, who's not the easiest person to read sometimes, but it's a book called The World Interior of Capital. And he talks about the Crystal Palace, the Great Exhibition of 1851, which Dostoevsky went to see, and wrote about in a book called Notes from the Underground. So he refers back to that. And he sees this almost like a metaphor. It is a real building. It wasn't until it was burnt down. It was a real structure, technologically quite an advanced one too. But he sees it as it's like the great tent that includes everything in the world, all desires, all futures, all wishes, all psychology is brought inside. And I suppose that's what consumerism does. So it's really hard now. You know, we get told, when my son was very small, there was something on the broadcast where they said blue is the new black, some fashion program. He went around for days saying, green is the new red, yellow is the new purple, because he got this idea that something else could be the, so. But it's actually quite confusing if things aren't what they say anymore. And capital produces this conjuring trick where nothing is what it seems. So the most utopian desires can be reappropriated into something like the Green Revolution, which is a kind of confidence trick. It's basically capital looking at how to control the world to make money. And I think with that comes the appropriation of political power too. If you look at something like the oil industry, the global oil industry. Very good and easy to read book called The Oil Road by James Marriott, published by Verso a year or two ago, where he looks at the building of a pipeline from Azerbaijan through to Europe, well, through to Turkey, then it goes in tankers, I think. Extraordinary, routine abuses of human rights and environmental rights by the oil industry, every day, all the time, completely normalized. That's what happens. And language gets taken over too. So the Green Revolution sounds fantastic. It sounds like the Green Party plus Zapatistas or something, but it isn't. And it really isn't. And we need to be very vigilant.
Shall we open it up to everybody now,
Yeah.
or do we just, or Andrés, did you want to say something briefly before we do that?
No, regarding that, though, I kept thinking on that, the same idea on the purposes for this utopia on modernity, and maybe the discourse is the same, no? Now, but people is no longer believing in it, in this utopia.
Yeah.
So, what would be the difference? We stop believing in that as a society.
We're told all the time, since Mrs. Thatcher, there is no alternative. It doesn't even say what there's no alternative to, but presumably the way things are. There is no alternative. So you don't like it, tough, put up with it. And it's actually your problem, because you're probably a shirker or a sponger or some member of the lower classes who we don't. And we make everything produced by robots, so we won't need the lower classes at all anymore. So they'll probably put something in the water at that stage. But it's it's kind of, I mean, it's difficult because the values that I've been trying to talk about are quite old ones now, but to me they are essentially modern. That is, modern, not medieval. They are part of a recognisably modern world, which has gone horribly wrong. Now, if it's gone horribly wrong, that must be partly because there's some flaw in those values themselves. So there's always a need to take them apart again and to see how we can rebuild that in a way that deals with some of those issues and doesn't become a utopia in terms of a closed model. Because utopia always gets a bad press because people say it's either fascist or communist and it tells you what to do, and that's that. But if you actually look in the literature, it isn't really like that at all. That's just a false idea. But it hasn't always been very good at the idea of emancipation at grassroots level. For example, if you look at someone like Robert Owen with his factories in New Lanark. They were very progressive in some ways, but he was absolutely in charge. So the power relations weren't questioned there. And a lot of it was really about increasing productivity. Well, what do we do with a thing like productivity? It's quite hard, but the Situationists in Paris in the 1960s, of course, invented this artwork called the dérive, the drift, which was an intentional waste of time. In a society based on productivity, well, we'll get some wine, we'll have a walk around the city, look for traces of the commune, and actually waste the whole day. Because in a society where productivity is key value, being unproductive is resistance. Now, you could also say, how long do you want to go on doing that for? Maybe there is a need for more than that, but I suppose it was a start.
But in the 70s, there was kind of this emerging idea of a workers' society, wasn't there? If you remember, and even in places like Germany, the idea that the retirement age would drop down and down and down to 50, 55, 50. And the notion would be that that people would be paid not to work.
They had that idea in France in the 1870s and 1880s.
Yes.
And Seurat's painting The Babus in the National Gallery has factory chimneys on the horizon. And it's painted on the banks of the Seine at a very precise point, which I've been to and walked along there and looked at where the chimneys are. He's moved them all right into the middle. Some have gone since then. The gas works is just being demolished now. But he's actually, which was quite normal at the time, reconstructed what was there conceptually to put the chimneys right in the centre, because, and he had read people like Kropotkin, mass production would solve the economic problem of scarcity, which is why some things were expensive and others weren't, and why you couldn't have stuff that you wanted. And it would be, well, a world of ease. And what you see in the picture, if you take that and the Grand Jacques, which is the companion painting that's now in Chicago, people of all social classes taking their leisure by the banks of the Seine. And there was a phrase, Holy Monday, Sunday, which was the whole little genre of prints and so on around that time of this. So the idea, well, Sunday was a holiday, you didn't work. That was pretty widely observed. But Holy Monday was when you didn't work then either. That was a very utopian kind of idea. Yeah. We've had other versions of that since.
Yeah.
The central thing, all the time we were talking, that seemed to be the most important, the most important thing for me was to hear you say that what you can't do is empower somebody else. People need to empower themselves, and that you have this domination or emancipation is the kind of binary thing. That the problem with the kind of modernist utopia is that what it never sought to do away with was a kind of hierarchy, whether it was a hierarchy of intellect or opportunity or those kinds of things, and that what contemporary network global capitalism kind of gives us a little glimpse of is an idea that we might find a way to network with each other in a kind of flat way. It kind of constantly takes it away all the time as well. But this idea that possibly what we have is an infrastructure that enables us to negotiate a kind of emancipation between ourselves. And that's why that's what really speaks to me about your project, is that there's this idea of connecting, these kind of connecting networks that allow people to connect across distance and difference and diversity. And it's put a thought into my head as to whether the new utopia, a kind of contemporary utopia, has to be about how more and more diverse people are enabled to think that it is their business to shape not just the kind of material world, but political and social relations.
But what about that conflict between the movement of information always wanting to be free and privacy? It was recently brought up in Dave Becker's book, The Circle. That whole idea that this whole idea that you will, through social media, know everything possible about everyone's lives. You lose privacy, and that's somehow aligned to Assange and Snowden, and somehow this business of the individual being somehow conflated with the state and privacy. I just wondered if anyone, sorry, am I getting lost here?
No, that's an important issue. It's topical.
But what I just want to, if we talk about social media,
Yeah.
these aren't free platforms.
No.
These are things that look like free and public platforms, but they're owned.
Yeah.
And so that's also it's another example of capitalism really confusing us by calling it one thing when actually it's another thing. But the question of privacy and information wanting to be free, I think it's a emerging conundrum.
And you also see that firms like Google and so on buy up little self-start enterprises that have got something really interesting and bring that inside too.
Yeah.
So they trade on this notion of, particularly Apple, creativity. It's cool and it's creative. And it might be. It's also about making huge sums of money. And we need to read it cautiously. But I think there is an important point about this notion of a network society, that it's seen as non-hierarchic. That's something that's relatively recent. That it might be an example where technology has enabled a way of thinking that wasn't there before. Because one of the flaws with, certainly if you look at something like urban planning, through the 20s, 30s, 60s, it was very top-down. And it wasn't that the politicians had the power so much, it was the planners had expertise. They knew what to do, so you should trust them to do it. And in Chicago, where a lot of this began in the 20s, the Chicagoans who were actually sociologists, they saw the city as a zone of conflict, basically. There were constant migrations, which caused conflicts in transitional areas, which had to be mediated in some way. And whereas politicians would make rival claims and fight against each other, the planner would be a sort of neutral expert who would sort it out, who would order it. So the city would go from a zone of conflict and violence and crime to a zone of ordering. But precisely ordering by the powers at the top. And then in places like, well, New York with Robert Moses, that led to huge freeways being carved out all over the place, lots of demolitions and so on.
It's interesting.
When people got worried.
Interesting you mentioned that Beeching was not a railway person, he was a chemist, which reminds me of the way borders get drawn up, like the Indian border was drawn up by someone who'd never been to India, who knew nothing about geography, and was sent off to a country cottage in Sussex and drew a line, literally.
Yes.
And so this whole idea, this apparent objective determining the fate of millions, you know, that goes with colonialism, I suppose. I'm just thinking maybe there's lots of people here. Particularly, I know we have an urban explorer. Would you like to say anything about what Malcolm's just said?
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that occurs to me that's sort of most interesting about your guys' project is in fact those connections, and I guess I was thinking about this question about social media. You know, it does. Yes, it's a platform that's owned by a major corporation and it has its faults, but it also enables you to communicate your project in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to. And the Situationists, obviously, we're very much proponents of entangling the spectacle by its own means, right? So if we can take these tools that corporations are providing to us for their own profit, and then reappropriate those tools for our own ends. And I guess in your case, you guys were sort of blogging while you were doing this. People knew that you were coming or expecting that you were going to arrive. And then you're using video cameras, you're using audio recorders, you're using all these technological tools to build connections. I'm just kind of interested in if you see those tools, were those tools wholly beneficial in your work? Were you aware that, or were you aware of a sort of a tension there?
Well, we always missed one person who would do the social media for us because we were very busy traveling and doing everything and taking the photos and jumping obstacles and doing all that stuff. So that part we see it always as positive, to share what we've been encountering. And we did it on our website and sometimes in Facebook and Twitter, but we need a bit maybe more people sharing those encounters, no? And seeing in real time what was happening. And those things are happening now. people is starting to get into the archives we created on the journeys and understand them as documents, which is, I think, very interesting. Regarding our posture on the use of social media as we don't as a controlled platform, it is, and I mean, we should maybe use that force like in judo, no? Like you use the force of the opponent to beat him.
Yeah.
And we're not planning to beat Facebook, no? But we use it as a platform, as one other platform.
Yeah, you can recognize it as helpful in building those local connections.
Another example would be the last general election campaign in this country, the way that posters were improvised. So the party would put out a poster or something, and some subtle changes were made, and it would just go out on the internet all over the place with the opposite messaging effect. So, and some of those were really very witty as well. Can't remember them all now, and there was some families sitting down saying how much they like this fox or rat soup or something.
But I also see someone in the audience who recently did a web project on art and religion. Do you have any?
Think about, you have the secular intention of Marxism, which then filters through in sort of 1930s very Church of England Christianity, which retains a religious aspect, and with the diminishing or the death or the murder of communism globally by capitalism, which did have an active anti-communist socialist sort of strategies, we then see, alongside scientific development, fundamentalist religion explode, and the notion of reason against enchantment, and that, you know, all cultures seem to be on the continuum somewhere on those two things. So I wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about religion resurfacing with communism disappearing, or socialism being...
John Roberts, who works at Wolverhampton University, has written some very good papers on Marxism and Protestantism, because he actually borrows quite a lot of the forms, obviously not all the content. Forms positive and negative, because it includes that tendency for there always to be sects that want to be more pure than the first one. And you find this actually produce some utopian settlements in North America, where a sect will break away from the Protestant church in, say, Germany, go and set up one there to be pure, where they were corrupt. Then another sect will break, no, you're too corrupt, we will be even more pure. So there's that sort of constant refinement, which becomes neurotic in the end. You see that in the activities of the British Communist Party in the 50s and 60s, where its main activities seem to turn to expelling people for being not quite on message, as it were.
And in situationism.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Oh, quite, yes.
I think they're still seeing it play out in our education system in the past week then as well. We've still got those very subtle how we manipulate public perception around these things, and it's
true.
It's not going to
and these very difficult issues. But I suppose I would say I think all education should be secular. And if you want faith stuff, you should do that outside. But I could very easily become rather doctrinaire about that.
Then the poor seem to have a political platform removed, with socialism being removed, and so gravitate towards religious.
Yes, I suppose that
I'm generalising.
that socialism in some ways claimed to offer the salvation that religion had previously offered. But that was also part of the problem, that you can't save people. They save themselves, but you can't do it for them. But there are all sorts of, and theology would be really interesting to study if you went back to look at the arguments around salvation through good works or faith alone, which go back to sort of Lutheran.
But you have that same principle of individuation within the interior, and that feeds straight into 20th century psychology and Freud and Marx and Hegel and Stein and all of the pragmatists as well. So it's a fascinating time, and the 1960s then throw back to the Belle Epoque and sort of the late 1900s. So there's a sort of cyclical pattern going on there as well. It's very complicated.
It's just very complicated. I'm not quite sure where we are in it now, but
I think with the point about language and tools was very interesting. Because if you don't use the tools or don't have access to the tools, then you can't be part of the free network. And again, that's the democratization of the net is culturally not very democratic in places.
No, I've seen value at some events that said, and this probably won't be true now because it's probably a long time ago, there are more telephones in Tokyo than the whole of Africa. Now, there are actually a lot of smartphones in Africa now, so the situation has all these mobile phones. So it has changed, and they sort of leapfrog one stage of the technology, but don't bother with landlines, just go straight to the mobile. However, I think the access to technology in Ireland is probably still way ahead of any African country. Africa's been placed, and it's very diverse in itself too. So there are imbalances there, of course, in distribution of benefit. But there's also an issue, I think, around seeing technology as the answer, rather than just the way towards part of the answer. I think that's quite dangerous. But, you know, I'm not a Luddite, I write my books on the computer, obviously. You don't want to go back to typewriters, redoing your whole page because of one mistake. No way. But I don't have a mobile phone, and I don't have a television, and there's quite a lot of technology I don't have by choice. Partly from temperament, because I'm quite an austere person in some ways. But of course also with climate change, it's actually necessary that we rethink how we live. And do we need all that stuff? Every smartphone has a little piece of stuff in it that's a rare earth that comes from a very small number of places in the world where wars tend to be fought over, mineral rights and so on. There are some difficult issues around some of the technology. And I don't think there's any way through that. They're just there. So it's got benefits, but it's got negative sides as well.
Andrés.
I wanted to ask you about coming back to the topics of modernity, ruin, heritage, utopia. How do you think, because sometimes I have the impression that making a heritage place something that could be useful, it's a way of killing the possibility to be useful or to have a utility or utilitarian life. What do you think about the heritage?
There could be two very different sorts of experiences. There's me and my son walking along the old railway track, finding little bits, traces of the railway by the side of the path, the ruins of a hut, a bit of a post with a sign on it and so on. That's really exciting because it's completely uninstitutionalized. It's just there. You can go and find it. There's no notice that says what it is, etc. And that's really enjoyable. And there's a kind of freedom involved in that. It could be turned into a landscape park with signs everywhere, and you could get a guide and one of those audio things that took you around it in 15 languages, and you might have to pay to go in, etc. There could be a museum at the end of it. And there could be all sorts of benefits to that in some ways, but it would be institutionalized, and actually I found it really boring. Walking around Ensure Park, I found there was actually quite a good balance, that it was sorted out in, it was ordered in certain ways. It was made reasonably safe, for example, though not excessively so. But it was a big enough area, I mean it's really massive, it's just huge, it goes on and on and on, that you could sort of get lost in it and have some of that wonder at suddenly coming around a corner and seeing an extraordinary structure. Think, wow, God, look at that, amazing. I think those moments of wonder are actually very important. I'll say why in a moment, or one reason why. So I think what they were trying to do in Germany was to take these huge, redundant industrial sites, and rather than demolish it all and start again, well, there was no starting. There's no need to rebuild an industry because there was no industry to rebuild then. It was over. So they've made them open access parks with some functional bits, but a lot that's just there as well. So I suppose I thought that was quite good in one way of doing it.
We have a question here.
Just to add to that, actually, Peter Latz, who's the landscape architect for Hampshire at Duisburg Nord, very much a kind of visionary amongst landscape architects. His philosophy behind creating that park was to say, I didn't want to destroy the place a second time.
Yeah.
That it had been remade for industry, but the remnants that industry had left behind were worth keeping because they were artifacts, they were relics of work and a way of life that could be re-inhabited. And I think that the sort of motivation to have the parks as a regenerating kind of factor came largely from the local councils, and
yes, absolutely.
not so much from the landscape architect who was really just interested in making
well, they were
a
desperate
cool
because
park.
the economy was over, and they needed to claim, they needed to be seen to look towards something. They had tried to set up a solar industry, but it has now been undercut by much cheaper production in China, apparently. So it's a shame, because that's quite a positive side to it. They did some important things like cleaning up the river, so depolluting the water. That was obviously necessary. And there's a massive amount of wildlife coming back into some of these places. Zollverein too. I can't remember what it is. There's a particular bird species that has come back into the whole area around Zollverein because of a particular tree that grows there wild. But it's self-seeding, and after 20 years you've got masses of them. And this bird is coming because it's exactly the right habitat for it. So all these things, you might not be able to predict that exactly, but you, as a landscape architect, you can set up a set of possibilities that might lead to some of those sorts of things happening.
Of course, the rewilding example is Chernobyl.
Ah,
which is the mighty ruin to end all
ruins. Of course, we now have it.
Yes. So could we do that without the thing actually blowing up next? There's still Hinkley Point out in Somerset. It's fair away from me, and the wind blows the other way, but quite a lot of people do that. If Hinkley Point goes up, that's the end of Bristol, basically. Just up the water.
We've also got the perfect counterexample here in London with Battersea Power Station. One of the last great industrial ruins in the city, and the chimneys are coming down next week.
Are they? Well, finally the campaign's been defeated. Because there was a local campaign about that, as it was iconic. Very grassroots for people to live.
This is what I hear. I mean, over the past 5 years, I've snuck into Battersea Power Station countless times and gone into the control rooms. I climbed the chimneys and sat on the lips of the chimneys. It's an incredible structure, and the thing that always occurred to me is that Duisburg Nord would be the perfect sort of model that we could have used to turn Battersea Power Station into an industrial ruin park that people.
I think the developers have somehow managed to trump up some sort of theory about how they're dangerous and what they really want to do.
Yeah, but anyone, if you get a structural engineer, they will always say it's dangerous because they're covering themselves in casing. That falls down, you soon firm.
And of course, because it's a listed structure, they're going to have to rebuild the chimney. I guess the materials or whatever, But it's macro, It's not all of the essence, the historical essence of the building will be lost in the same way that when you have these chimneys sticking up in the middle of a new housing estate. I mean, there's no context. There's nothing left there to hold on to.
Can I just ask, sorry, because I know what you do. What is the final frontier for the urban explorer? Where have you not been?
I'll tell you what. There's an abandoned metro station in Pyongyang. If anyone could get to. But I've been into all the abandoned tube stations in London as well. I've been to the mail rail, which stretches from Paddington to Whitechapel.
Were you driving the train?
I didn't drive the train.
Okay.
I wish I had.
I mean, people like Gove and Cameron talk about British values, and I have no idea what they mean by that. Because I didn't go to Eton, so I can't share their culture. The ingenuity, the inventiveness, the technical prowess of building things like Battersea Power Station wasn't that something that Britain actually was known for at a certain point?
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly, I'm sure lots of other countries produced equally important good structures, of course. So I'm not a nationalist. I'm a European, if anything. But wasn't there something about those structures that showed, wow, we could do that?
Yeah, it was the largest brick building in Europe, and you saw the passing of modernity in the building, in the two halves of the building, an A side and B side building in 1920 whatever, and then 1950 something, and of course all of the control rooms and everything that that have exactly what you're talking about, that sort of, that visceral heritage value where you can go in and sort of experience sort of not having a guide or an interpreter and seeing the control rooms and standing there in these, control rooms that were functioning.
Maybe when it is redeveloped, they should put up a huge billboard that says, when this was a power station, it was owned by the state. And the infrastructure belonged to us all in those days. That's something that might one day come back. The idea of renationalising the railways is being talked about quite a lot at the moment, and it doesn't seem to get too negative a reaction. East Coast trains are owned by the state, in effect, it's slightly arm's length.
Well, they've been banned from reapplying for the franchise.
Yes, but they actually work quite well.
It's incredible, it's ironic.
To Newcastle.
I know.
And it's a pretty good service.
Yeah.
Again, it's an
Unlike
interesting.
the shit
Yeah.
I'm in the West Country.
Yeah.
Just because,
Sorry.
no, I think that they've realised that whatever they do, whether it's socialism or capitalism, they have to make up the jobs. So nationalising things is a good way of creating jobs.
Well, having
You
a
can
massive,
capitalise it.
and if you have a big enough state bureaucracy, everyone can have a job. So you have to actually do anything that needs doing, but they could at least be employed. But you could also look at that in terms of having a national minimum income of, say, 10,000 a year, something like that. See what a living wage.
International minimum income,
Yeah.
sort of,
So I'd like to finish this at 1:30, so we've got another 5 minutes so we can get out into the sunshine and enjoy the SEFT once more. So can we have any final words, final thoughts from anybody? Yes.
I wanted to know about taking SEFT through the Channel tunnel.
Oh, that would be very interesting.
What
At
gauge?
the moment we-
So the tunnel.
So you could put it on the train. You could put it on the train and take it.
Yeah. Well, yes, you could put it on one of the lorry transporters. At the moment, we have a bit of a conundrum because it's a Mexican vehicle and was imported to the UK, and unfortunately, it's not legal to drive in the UK. We've tried all sorts of different ways of
They must
working out how
have
to
things
do it.
there's not a recovery vehicle on the train through the Channel.
Yeah. There are lots of things we would have liked to
We
have
got a new
done.
with the steering wheel in the right hand.
The other
I'd be
issue
happy to
is,
help you with that.
the other thing is that so many of the abandoned tracks around the UK are now run by heritage societies, so they want to use them for
Well,
their
the
own
problem is
purposes.
that British Rail lifted the track when they closed the lines, so you have to put it back again.
Yeah.
And then it's owned by
The heritage railways have done that at a huge effort and expense, but there are lots where that hasn't happened yet. 30 or 40 at least branch lines that are just gaps.
He just showed me a video of a friend that made a small motor for the tracks, and he's traveling around doing some explorations in.
Yeah, he's been
around
driving them
Manchester.
around Manchester and also around Wales. Yeah, they're all slight line.
That's the research we need.
No permissions,
Yeah.
just a train timetable, a very precise one.
Very precise.
I mean, there's a whole realm where things can be done without kind of feral rail explorer.
They would need to know when the express was due and if it was on time. And you can find all that out from a new website called Real-Time Trains. Can't remember what you find it if you just put that in research. It's been set up quite recently. You can get an app for it as well, which tells you the time of all passenger and freight trains in the country in real time. Are they on time? Where are they? What platform will they arrive at in the station? It's an amazing job that one person has developed all this. Out of a kind of obsession, I suppose. But it's there. It's really useful if you're travelling around trying to make a connection somewhere. You see, right, it's 10 minutes late on platform 7, we've just got time to go on the subway.
That's very useful.
Or, no way, let's have coffee. But if you were doing a sort of feral rail thing, you need to know, particularly when the freight trains come, because they run all night.
If you had just the right anorak, you'd probably have it committed to memory.
Right.
Years ago when I was visiting Britain and not coming to live, I booked a ticket to Scotland from a guy at the counter with a sort of rain of dandruff on his shoulders, and when I asked him what time the train were, he didn't look at the computer, he just closed his eyes, and I could see him reading, and I thought, I'm in England.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. There'll be, I think the artists will be up at, you're going to stay till 6 o'clock, so if you want to chat informally back up. Yeah, no, I think you can go around if you want, but I just suggest artists stick around.
We'll leave it open, okay?
Yeah. Anyway, there they are, if you want to catch them all. Malcom informally now. I'm going to close the discussion and get back up into the sunshine myself. Thank you very much for coming.